Hi, folks. Everybody staying warm? Boy, this weather's been something, hasn't it? I'll tell you what. A lot of people struggling with the weather, which I get that. I think I told my story. I'm going to apologize in advance to everyone in this room. I think I've already said this before, but if I tell a story more than once, then you have to just kind of nod and say, "Yeah, yeah, it's fine, okay, Dr. Barnes." But my very first year here, I came from Oklahoma, and I thought, uh, that the traditions for weather would be the same, but they're completely different. Like Oklahoma, you get like a one snowflake hits the ground and everything all of a sudden shudders to a halt. My first year here, I was living out by the lake in a rental house out there, and it was like 3 inches of snow, and everything was covered in snow. And I thought, oh, they're going to close campus today. And I looked, and there was just no information about closing campus, no details on that. I was like, oh, okay. And so I went to campus, and I'm kind of surprised they didn't close. And they look at me funny, and it's like, closed for this amount of snow? This is nothing. And it turns out that snow is actually not the root driver of what causes campus to close. It's actually when it gets really slick and it's hard to walk, like on the sidewalks and get that. That's when they start worrying about campus closing because of the liability. But just snow, there's like, just no big deal. I did make some concessions to the snow last time. I think you all had the ancillary benefit of concessions, so you didn't have to come to class on that day. My auditing students, they were the ones who really benefited because I basically said, all right, if you're on campus today, you can take the exam. If not, you can take the exam on Friday. All right. There was much cheering and rejoicing on Yik Yak from what I've been told. I don't know. I'm not on the Yak, but Dr. Caden gives me updates of what's going on Yik Yak, and so yeah. That's I get my secondhand information on what goes on Yik Yak and Dr. Caden. So that might be just be a word of warning. If you ever post on Yak, just know that Dr. Caden is monitoring you. So she don't think she knows what your user ID is, but she does know things going on. Is that ratting her out? Is that a bad thing to do, or that's good for transparency? What do you guys think? It's fair. It's fair information. All's fair information. We're talking about a profession that requires transparency, so transparency is really important. All right. Before we get started today, I just wanted to make a quick announcement because I think there was some. It may have been my lack of communication. It's entirely possible. I've been noticing that as I get older, I tend to miss really important things. We've had Janine as our department secretary not secretary, administrative assistant. My apologies, administrative assistant for going on 6 months now, and I've been spelling her name wrong for 6 months. So that kind of tells you where my mind is at, that I'm just not catching things as quickly as I used to. But I was receiving some emails over the past couple of weeks, and don't get me wrong, I'm really happy to receive emails when there's questions about things. But a lot of people were saying questions about they can't make class. Is it possible that I could record the lectures? I just want to reiterate, I record all of my lectures, all of the class sessions, with the exception of like class sessions that do not need to be recorded. So exam reviews, I will not record the tail part of that, or those class sessions. I didn't record on Wednesday because we were doing an assignment in class, but everything else when we do an activity in class, I record it and I post it to YouTube, and those links are actually available on Brightspace. So if there was some confusion on that part, I sincerely apologize, but I try to make it as accessible as possible for this class, especially if you have questions about something. One of the things that came up is there were a lot of NetSuite questions, and I'm happy to answer those, but those are also available via YouTube presentations because I recorded it, put it on YouTube, and you can refer back to that. So yeah, just as additional resource for you guys. All right, talk about Excel, shall we? Today we're not going to be doing anything too intense, too rigorous, but I do want to talk a little bit about an introduction to visualization. One thing about Excel is it's a really, really good intermediate tool, but it's not going to be particularly advanced in anything. It's like the Applebee's of data tools. Like you can go to Applebee's and you can get a good meal. It's never going to be the best meal you ever had of any type. It'll be a fine hamburger. I shouldn't say Applebee's. I actually really don't like Applebee's. What's a good one? Chili's? Okay. Is anybody okay with Chili's like that? Is there a better one that I should pick up to? I don't want to say Denny's because that one just has a big negative connotation. But we'll say this like the Chili's of tables. You'll get a good meal there. You'll enjoy it in most situations. TGI Fridays. There we go. There we go. That's the one. Since it's Friday, that's the appropriate one. So yeah. So I want to do some introduction to visualization. We will talk about a visualization tool a little bit later in this course. Chapter 11, we're actually going to do some work in Power BI. And you probably have had some experience on your own. You may have done Tableau. You may have done Power BI on your own. That's great. The more experience and exposure you get to this is important. The reason that we do still focus on Excel, and the reason we have entire courses that are Excel is that's kind of the gateway tool for everything else. And plus, partners and employers who are hiring from Truman State, they basically say strong Excel skills will lead to strong skills in other areas. That's kind of the virtue that we operate from. So we're going to do something very basic today. I'm assuming that most of you will have done this, at least in some capacity or another. But I do want to reiterate this point because I think this is going to be a good reflection on what we will need to know as we move forward with visualization. Can Excel do visualization? Yes. In fact, it was probably one of the most renowned visualization tools 20 years ago. I remember I used to work in a program, an analytical program called IDEA, and we did all of our data analysis in IDEA, then exported everything to Excel to create the report, because Excel was kind of the only visualization tool in the market. Now you've got really powerful visualization that can do so much more than what you can do in Excel, and it's naturally set up. It's just a native state. You don't have to do the conversions. It will just automatically create the visualization for you. Well, let's see what Excel can do. Let's do a very, very basic one. So you'll notice here, oh my goodness, I just realized, I'm so embarrassed. I tried to update this, and you'll notice I say January 25th instructor rankings, but I got August listed here. So I'm just going to change this to January. Okay. That's my fault. That's my fault. I got distracted when I was updating information. So my bad. Okay. That's fair game if you want to put in my evaluations. Forgot to update the spreadsheet. That's fair. All right, I missed that one. All right. So what can we do with this information? Well, we've got some instructor rankings, but most people tend to operate in a manner that looking at data like this, it can provide some value, but it's more valuable when you actually have some visual tools. So let's do a very simple visual cue, and I'm just going to highlight instructor and rating information. I actually don't even need the month, but I wanted it there for posterity purposes. And we're just going to go and we're going to click on insert. And there's a lot of charts that we can put in here. We're just going to do a very basic bar chart. The 2D column bar chart, something like this. And honestly, this is fine. I will use this type of chart in many scenarios, and it does provide context for information. In fact, I'll use it in this course. When we start talking about exams and I show you the exam breakdown, I'll use a chart just like this. So very, very simple and straightforward, not particularly difficult. The nice thing is that this is kind of nice for people who don't use Excel. You can put this into many settings, and they'll say, all right, that's a good presentation. It's meaningful. It provides some context. But I think we can do better than that. And to reiterate that, let's go to a little bit more complex data set. Let's go ahead and we're going to go to the second data set here. And we've got some rankings for 2025. Now, obviously, these are fictitious rankings. You can tell because I rated Dr. Deers a low ranking at the very beginning. Dr. Deers is amazing, by the way. If you've not interacted with Dr. Deers, she's one of the most wonderful human beings on the planet. Which I've said that both about Dr. Otero and Dr. Caden, and I'm saying about Dr. Deers. I guess the only person who's not wonderful is Dr. Ison. Yeah, so yeah, you can tell him I said that. So this thing is a step below wonderful. Still a good dude, but not necessarily wonderful in that ranking. Okay, and he might get offended by that. I would love to see Dr. Ison offended sometimes. He usually is just like kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever, man. Yeah, this is the way that Dr. Ison operates. So anyway, let's go ahead and let's highlight all the data that's on this table, A through C. And we're going to create a pivot table, which I'm sure you've done before, especially if you've taken 153. You probably had much experience with pivot tables. I would assume that like half the class in that course is pivot tables because it's Dr. Caden designed the course, and she loves pivot tables. My guess is like tonight, when they're trying to think about what they want to do for dinner as a family, she's going to chart the options in a pivot table and come up with that conclusion. She's just like a pivot table fanatic. And I'm like, pivot tables are good. They're not the end all be all of existence, but I think she would disagree with me. So highlight the data and there. We're going to click on pivot table. There's actually multiple ways you can create a pivot table, but this is just the simplest one. Let's go ahead and we got the range already selected. Let's put this in the existing worksheet. We'll start it at D1. Okay. So start in the instructor ratings table at D1. And I do like pivot tables because they are customizable because you can actually set up the way you want the pivot table to look. We're just going to do a very simple, straightforward setup. We're going to drag month down into columns. We're going to drag instructor down into rows. And then we're going to filter values on rating. And these are sum of ratings, which I don't think really provides much value here in the grand total. So let's go ahead and let's change this from sum of ratings. We're going to click and go to value field settings. And I'd like you to select average. And so now we have a little bit more meaningful data. And you can see some interesting takeaways here. Like Dr. Deers, who I gave a very bad rating to start out with, she kind of came back strong. All right. Everybody started saying, yeah, Dr. Deers, yeah, pretty sweet. She's great. She does good work. Okay. Dr. Caden started out strong and well, yeah. But for all the hoopla I make about Dr. Caden's performance, you'll notice she still outranks me pretty substantially. Okay. Which yeah, I guess that's kind of the ultimate takeaway is that even if people say Dr. Barnes, you're great, Dr. Caden will always be a step above great. Okay, so that's going to be my ultimate conclusion there. This is actually pretty useful, and it allows us to filter on multiple rows of information. But again, I'm assuming that you're already familiar with pivot tables. A pivot table is not really a visualization tool, but it does carry characteristics of visualization because when we start dealing with pure visualization, we start looking at Power BI. One thing we're going to notice is that it's very adaptive to information and it can update automatically. Excel has something like that I kind of like. So we're just going to combine this chart that we've created, and we're going to combine the pivot table into another one. So let's go ahead, right click on 2025 instructor rankings, and we're just going to copy this. We're going to create move or copy. You can click on create a copy and move it to the end. I'm going to create one called 2025 instructor ratings 2. I'm just going to do the straight up delete. I'm going to highlight columns D through I. I'm just going to right click and delete so we can get rid of that pivot table. Because pivot tables are fine, but what we're about to do is a lot cooler. Don't tell Dr. Keene I said that. Although to be fair, I did say that she's monitoring you on Yik Yak, so turnabout's fair play. So if you do want to tell Dr. Keene I said that, that's fine, I guess. All right, highlight, and we're going to go to insert again. We're going to go all over here close to the middle, and we're going to click on pivot chart. You'll notice it looks just exactly the same setup as a pivot table. And in fact, it does contain elements of pivot table. We're just going to keep the same range. We're going to go existing worksheet. We're going to start, we'll say D1 again. And lo and behold, it's actually going to create a pivot table that we're going to set up, but it also creates a graph here. And the graph is the most important part. So let's go ahead and do the same setup. Legend, we're going to say month, axis, instructor, rating, values. I don't think we need to change the sum of the rating to average. You can if you want to, but we're not going to be really looking at the pivot table itself. Instead, we're going to look at this chart. And this is the thing that I like because I'm a big fan of visualizations that are adaptive. I'm going to go ahead, kind of roll this across the entire screen. Not quite that big, but enough to take up the entire screen. And so this is kind of a dynamic chart that encompasses all of the data that we put into there. And we can sort and organize this information in many different ways, but we're just going to do some simple analysis. The thing that's really, really valuable about interactive pivot or interactive visualizations is not that they provide visual cues of the data. We can do that already in Excel, but that we can, in real time, adapt the data to whatever purposes and whatever information we want. Now, back when I used to work with data analysis, when we have to do breakouts of data and information, we would just be looking at individual records. Well, something we can do with the visualization is we can look at individual records, but still keep it in a visual format. So let's say we want to look just at the month of February, see how performance looked in February. We can actually click on just February and select that, and we'll show all of our records for February. We could even just, do we want to do a couple months, like want to do the last 2 months, we could do March and April. It's customizable in that regard. And it actually customizes on multiple different parameters because we're filtering on the month, but we also have instructor. So let's say we want to go ahead and see a Dr. Otero. And look at Dr. Otero. She just starts strong and finishes strong. Keeps moving up over time. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at Dr. Deers and Dr. Caden together. Get the two tax professors and see what happens. Boy, that's a story to be told right there. One going in one direction, one going the other direction. I don't know what the implication is of that. You can make your own judgment on that. Or just for fairness sake, the audit professor versus the tax professor. I think we can agree the tax professor wins in this particular one, this particular round. But yeah, kind of neat, a little customizable tool. It's a little bit different than the parameters we use. That's what I kind of think is neat. Again, I'm not a big fan of pivot tables, but I do like pivot charts an awful lot. This is going to be very similar to what we're going to see when we see a customizable usage of the information within Power BI here in a few weeks. But with that, we got homework to talk about. All right. So first question, which of the following is not an activity within the sales and collection process? Again, you've heard me gripe about this before. I don't like questions that are set up this way, although occasionally I will ask them just for context purposes. But this is a pretty easy one. So let's just go through the answers. Selling products and services. Is that sales and collection? Is that a revenue process or an activity? Yes, it is. Billing customers. Yep. We want to make sure we get the cash. Okay. Managing inventory. This one's a little bit dicey. You can make an argument that managing inventory is an external process, but it is separate, definitely related to the revenue process. It's very difficult for most organizations to generate revenue if they don't manage their inventory. You can make an argument that service organization does not need to manage inventory, and that's a fair statement. But from the context of the perspective of the book, they're saying managing inventory would definitely be a sub-process because you need to have inventory to actually generate the sale. So if you answered this one and says it was not a part of that, I would argue that's a rational statement. Okay, that's a rational answer. The argument the book is making is that if we're assuming we're a manufacturing organization, as was kind of we started with in chapter 5 when we talked about it on Monday, this would be a fundamental process to the fundamental activity in this revenue process. Recording payments from customers, yes, we're going to get cash. We need to actually recognize the cash receipts. So all of the above are sales and collection activities. That's the answer the book gives. Again, I could see some argument for C. If I were to ask you a question like this on the exam, which I would not, but if I asked you a question like this on the exam, I would give you credit if you answered C, because I think everybody could make a legitimate argument for both of these answers. All right, question number 2. Sales and collection process is the point of contact between the firm and which set of external business partners? This should be a pretty easy question. I realize this is a straightforward slam dunk question, but this is something that I want to reiterate because a lot of the questions we're going to come up with later on in the semester, you do need to remember this is the party that actually relates to revenue. So who do we sell goods and services to? Customers, okay? And again, I realize that's a simple question. It's like, I can't believe you're wasting your time talking about this. I want you to remember this moment because we're going to talk about what it is that we want to have interactions with respect to revenue. Revenue are always going to be relevant to customers. That is not to say that vendors do not have some impact on the supply chain and the revenue process, but by and large, everything related to revenue are interactions with customers. So keep that in mind as we move forward. All right. Question number 3, which of the following sales and collection process activities can result in the creation of an accounts receivable? Okay. So this is a really important one and one that we talked about on Monday that I said was really, really critical to remember this step. So basically what we're trying to say is that where do we create the receivable? And you learned about this in 220. You said whenever we actually create the sale. So when the sale is recognized, the point that we need to note is where do we recognize the revenue? And again, if you're an accounting major and you've taken 302 with Dr. Eisen, he probably knows about this whole performance obligation. We're not going to get in depth in that and talking about the nature of performance obligations, but we do need to have a point in time in which we recognize the transaction. So in our scenario, we said, once we meet our obligation, that's when we recognize revenue. That's when we recognize the revenue. That's when we recognize the receivable. What is that point in time? The answer was the shipping the ordered products to the customer. Now, keep in mind, this is based on the assumption that it's freight on board shipping point. Once they leave the warehouse, they're now the customer's responsibility. We get to recognize the revenue. If I gave you that extraneous assumption saying freight on board destination, that would change slightly. We would need to change this answer to say when the customer receives the goods that have been shipped to them. So that's a really small distinction, but an important distinction to make. All right. Question number 8. Which of the following is an example of a business rule implementing access controls? So access controls were distinguished from application controls. What is the party that we're primarily dealing with when we deal with access controls? Is it going to be the employees or the systems? The employees, okay? We're talking about access controls. We're talking about employees. That's you all accessing the computers, accessing Brightspace, all right? That was the example we talked about in class. We're talking about application controls. Those are things that the system does, all right? So when we talk about things that are rules that implement access controls, the warehouse containing inventory must be locked when the inventory management is not present, okay? So let's think about that. Who is going to be accessing inventory? That would be something the employees are going to be accessing. So this is specifying what the employees can and cannot do with respect to access. So that sounds like a possible answer. Let's move on. Users recording collections cannot modify sales records. In an organization, the users are generally the employees. Okay. By the way, I don't know why they have why am I blanking on this apostrophe there? It should just be users, no apostrophe. But cannot modify sales records, but it's still employees. So B seems the possible answer as well. Computer systems will generate an audit trail. This is definitely a business rule that implements a control, but what type of control are we talking about here? Is this an access control? No, it's an application control because this is something that's done by the system, okay? So that would be an application control. Internal auditors should be used. That's not really a control. That's just a kind of general guideline for a business. So both A and B are business rules implementing access controls. I would say that's a correct statement because those dictate employee activity. All right, I know you guys were looking forward to this, just so much so that you probably could not wait until today to talk about it. Everybody wanted to stampede on a Wednesday and talk about UML diagrams, okay? So the wait is over. We're going to talk about them today. All right. Refer to the association marked with the number 1 in the preceding diagram, which of the following is the best description of the association. So let's go ahead and take a look at number 1. So 1 is dictating the relationship between sales and employees. So the best way to approach questions like this, and there will be questions like this in the exam, is to interpret both sides of the association first, okay? So sales involve 1 employee and only 1 employee. That's the way we'd interpret that. Employees can be involved in 0 sales because you have employees that are not part of the sales process. Or employees can be involved in many sales, as much as many sales, okay? Can be involved in many sales. So now we've actually specified that, let's go ahead and talk about these. Each employee participates in at least 1 sale. Nope, that's not correct. We know that employees can be in 0 sales. Each employee participates in a minimum of 0 sales. Yep, we just said that. So B is our answer, but let's go through the rest. Each employee participates in a maximum of 1 sale. No, maximum is many. It could be many sales. Each employee participates in at least 2 sales. I don't think that we could actually set a multiplicity to 2. That would be silly, okay? None of these are description of association. Well, since B is, then E cannot be our answer. So B is our answer. All right. It's not good about number 1. We've already talked about number 1, so let's interpret the other side of the multiplicity. Each sale may have multiple employees. How many employees can we have on a sale? 1 and only 1, okay? 1 and only 1. Each sale may involve no employees. That, by the virtue of the previous one, was not correct. Each sale is associated with a minimum of 1 employee. That is correct. Each sale is associated with a maximum of many employees. That is not correct. So C is our answer because E cannot be the answer. All right. Oops. I don't know why. I didn't include 12 in the homework, did I? Gracious. So y'all were just kind of like indulging me. Thank you so much for that. I know I get old and a little bit dottery. Okay. So, all right, 14. Further association remarked number 2 in the preceding diagram. Let's go ahead and do the same thing with number 2, okay? So we're talking about the association with employees and cash receipts. So cash receipts can be processed by 1 employee and only 1 employee. That's easy. Employees can be involved in 0 cash receipts and multiple cash receipts. So that's a possibility as well. So going down to 14, each cash receipt may involve multiple employees. No. Each cash receipt may involve no employees. No. Okay. Each cash receipt associated with only 1 employee. Yes, we have an answer. Each cash receipt associated with maximum many employees. No. So C is our answer. All right. I promise I won't do 15 this time. We'll go ahead and move down to 17. Refer to the associate mark number 3. All right. So number 3, what do we got? Number 3, sales to customers. Okay. So again, sales involve 1 customer and only 1 customer. Customers can have 0 sales because they could come and they can come to the store and say, not buy anything. All right. Or customers can have many sales. That's a possibility. Or a customer cannot buy anything. I think that's how the book characterizes 0 sales to a customer. They could say the customer just hasn't bought anything yet, which is a little bit forward thinking in that regard. But either way you want to interpret it is fine. All right. So what is the best interpretation of the minimal multiplicity to 0 instead of 1? So that's what we were just talking about. So customers don't pay. No, customer would still have a sales transaction in that case. Customers place their orders, don't pick up their items. Well, if they place their orders, that's still considered to be recorded as a sales transaction. Some sales are made in cash and customer information not recorded. That's an interesting one. We didn't talk about that possibility, but is it a possibility? Yeah, and would it still result in a sales transaction without customer information? Yeah, because customer information is not recorded. So C seems like a viable answer, but let's go ahead and go to D. Customers never buy anything. Well, that seems like a possible answer too, but it seems like the less interpretive answer because there wouldn't be a sales transaction in that case. So C seems like the most logical answer for what we talked about in sales, that 0 multiplicity. So we're going to say C. Even though I think D is a possible answer, I think C is a better one. Refer to the association marked number 5 in the diagram. So let's go to number 5. All right. So inventory and sales. So inventory can be involved in 0 sales. You can just have inventory that never gets sold, but inventory can be involved in multiple sales. Sales has to have at least one piece of inventory. Okay. So assuming it's a retail business that sells manufactured or merchandise goods, whatever it might be, they are going to sell inventory. Every single sale has to involve inventory. There's no service sales owned solely. So one piece of inventory has to be sold in order for a transaction to occur, but it can involve multiple pieces. People can buy more than one item. Pretty reasonable, pretty representative. Okay. So moving back down to 21. Sales are allowed if they include at least one inventory item. So this is talking about business rules, about which is the best example of business rules that constrains the association. What do you guys think about A? Does that sound like a reasonable business rule? That's an allowed business rule. That's one of our business rule categories. Remember, we have obligatory, prohibited, and allowed business rules. And this sounds like an allowed business rule. Okay. So that's going to be one that constrains the association. I think that's a possibility. And by the way, the book does not recognize this one as a correct answer, but I think this is possibly a correct answer. I would consider it one. Sales are prohibited if they include more than one inventory item. Well, let's talk about that. Is that a correct statement based on what we looked in the association? No, it's not. It's not. You can have sales with more than one inventory item. Sales must include at least one inventory item. That is a correct answer. Okay. Now, the difference is the question is which is a stronger statement, A or C? And I think both of those are reasonable statements. But I think the one that constrains the business or as a constraining business rule is going to be C, which is why they say that's the correct answer, because it says in order to have a sale, you have to have a business item. Right? I do think A is still a reasonable answer for interpretation. I wish they hadn't included that one because it's a little bit dicey, but C is probably a stronger answer. Sales are allowed within the manager's approval in advance. That's not even relevant to what we talked about. So none of the above. We know C is an answer. So C is our answer here. Question 25. Let's look at association with marked with number 7. Oh, number 7 is an interesting one because what's happening here? Number 7. Oh, we can't interpret this. So we have to interpret this. So this is when we have to interpret the multiplicity. Now, the question comes up. Would I be cruel enough to ask you to make your own multiplicities on the exam? The answer is I am that cruel. Okay. So keep in mind that you will have to not only interpret existing multiplicities, but in some very, very obvious scenarios, like I think this one's pretty straightforward, you would have to interpret the multiplicities. I do allow for room for interpretation as long as you can justify the multiplicity. If it's, I have a predefined answer and you have a different answer, but your answer is a really good one, I'll say that makes sense. Okay. Let's think about this in context. Okay, so we're talking about sales and cash receipts, okay? So this one's a really interesting one. What are we going to be talking about with respect to cash receipts are involved in how many sales? So can we have cash receipts for 0 sales? No, there doesn't make sense to have cash receipts if there's no sales, okay? That's the only reason we receive cash receipts if the sales took place. So minimum multiplicity has to be at least 1. Can we make that agreement? Okay, because we can have a cash receipt on 1 sale. Can we have cash receipts for multiple sales? Like, could you have a cash receipt that somebody's paying for multiple sales transactions at one time in one cash receipt? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to say this one is 1 to many right here. I think that's the most reasonable interpretation here. What about down here? Sales can be involved in 0 to 1 cash receipts. So in that case, sales can be involved in 0 to 1 cash receipt. So you can have a sale. Why is 0 a possibility here? I know the 1 have to be as relevant to cash receipts because you're going to see the cash at least one time. Again, that it precludes the possibility that you could pay for the sale multiple times. You could say 0 to many, okay? That would actually say that the sale could be involved in many cash receipts. You pay for one part of the sale, like on layaway, you make installment payments. But assuming that they pay for all the cash or all the sale at once, it's going to be 0 to 1. Why is the 0 on the other end? That one's a little bit more depressing. Why is this not a 1-to-1 relationship? The possibility that we could generate a sale and then customer fails to pay us. Yes, that's the problem with working on an accrual basis in a business-to-business model. So this one is 0 to 1, but we're going to have a little bit of definition for that one. So let's go ahead and go back to question number 25. All right. Assume the customers pay for all sales in full at the end of the month, which of the following is a multiplicity that should be next to the cash receipt class. So they pay for all sales in full at the end of the month, then the multiplicity is going to be 0 to 1, which is what I was talking about. Okay. They can't pay for their sales in part. Any sales that are outstanding have to be paid for all together. So every single sale has to be paid in full, meaning that maximum multiplicity is always going to be a 1. All right. That's why we have a 0 to 1 here. That makes sense? Everybody understand the explanation? That one's a little bit more confusing than the ones we've looked at, so I want to make sure we're clear on that one. All right. This one's an interesting one. Moving on 26. Dog market number 7. Assume the customers pay for sales a month in the full in the month. Which of the following multiplicity that we found next to the sales class? We already talked about that one. We said one to many. And again, we said that they could pay for one sales transaction or all of their sales transactions if they had more than one sales transaction during the month. So that's why we have a one to many. So just as a reiteration, based on the characteristics we talked about here, this was a one to many up here, and this is a 0 to 1 here. The reason this is a 0 to 1 is based on the criteria in question 25 that says that they have to pay for all of their sales in full by the end of the month. If we had a criteria that said they could pay for their sales in installments like a layaway plan, this would be a 0 to many. So there's a bit of a distinction here. So again, this interpretation is based on what information you're presented with. Question number 27. Referring back to that association, okay? Assume the customers pay for sales in full at the end of the month. Which of the following is the best example of a business rule that constrains this association? All right. So let's go ahead and go through. A, customers are allowed to pay for sales on credit. Does that make sense? Yeah, well, we would assume that's the case because they're collecting cash at the end of the month. So that assumes the extension of credit to customers. So A is probably our answer. Let's go through the rest. Customers must pay for sales at the time of sale. We wouldn't have a separate cash receipts process if we needed that, so that can't be correct. Customers prohibited from paying for sales on credit. We know that's not correct because they actually say that customers pay for sales at the end of the month. Customers may delay payment for a sale on approval of manager. This is possible, but it doesn't really define. It's not defined by the business rules. It does not really say that that's actually in the case. So is this a possible rule? Yes. Is it related to our multiplicities? No. Okay, we can't interpret that from the information given. So A is our answer. All right. Now we get to do some diagrams. What do you guys say? Take a look at those. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the questions and we'll look at the diagrams here. So discussion questions. By the way, did everybody catch that I said discussion questions specifically and didn't go to problems? Be very, very clear when you look through these because I am going to start jumping around from discussion questions to problems in these next few. I tried to tell you, give you advance warning, but you do need to be aware of that because it does traditionally happen that when I move from problems to discussion questions, people still answer problems. I'm not going to count off on the homework, but you would just have to catch up on the stuff that we're talking about because this would be the stuff that I would test you about. So it says, draw a basic sales activity model for a fast food restaurant, and then draw a second basic sales activity model for BPM for a traditional restaurant. We're going to discuss the similarities and differences, and then we're going to talk about adding reservations to the second model. All right. So what's my favorite fast food restaurant to talk about? The one that I never eat at, but I talk about all the time. The Taco Bell. Ding. Yeah, Taco Bell. So what does that look like when you go into Taco Bell? Okay. You go in and say, I want my Mexican pizza. So that's taking the order. Okay. Then what happens when the order happens? Okay. It's sent to the back. What do you do in the meantime while you're waiting for your order to process? Okay. You pay. Okay. So they take your payment. All right. Then after the payment, they assemble your order and then they're going to deliver your order. That pretty traditional fast food setup. So we can kind of say that, let me zoom in. This would be a very representative BPMN diagram, okay? Customer arrives, that's the event that starts. Activity is taking the order, taking the payment, assembling the order, giving customers the order, and then going to the end, okay? That's when the end event happens, when the customer receives their order. That's our performance obligation met. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a traditional restaurant. So instead of going to Taco Bell, you go to Maxwell's. Okay, I was at Maxwell's last night. I had the cowboy burger. It was delicious, all right? But yeah, we go to Maxwell's. So how is this going to start out? Is this going to start out with the customer arrives and the customer takes the correct customer order? That same process? Yeah. Okay. So we're so far so good. So then the person who is taking your order is serving you. They take your cash right then and there, right? No. Okay. Usually what happens is they assemble your order, they give it to you, and then after the meal, that's when they take your cash. All right. So there is a bit of a differentiation in here. And that the collect payment doesn't occur until after everything takes place. So very similar BPMN diagram, but a little bit of a difference. Now the question is, what happens to reservations? So you're going to have fancy reservations. They're going to go to my favorite place, Seabreeze. They request reservations. You go there. Although if you show up and say, I'd just like some food, they may say, wait, come on in. Okay. But they request reservations. And I always send in a reservation, even though they know I'm always coming in. So what's going to happen in that situation? So we're going to have basically our same diagram here for the last part. But you'll notice with the reservations, the customer arrives and there's going to be a step where they say, do you have a reservation? Okay, because it's a fancy place. You have to have a reservation. It's like some of those fancy places in bigger cities that say you have a reservation. Is there any place in Kirksville that requires a reservation? Like actually you cannot get in without a reservation? I'm trying. I've only been to Bonsai once, and I think we had reservations there. That's the only place I can think of. But they'll seat you even. Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Kirksville's not snobby like other places. All right, not snobby like the place we're talking about here. So check your reservation. They'll actually see, does your reservation match the time that you're sitting down? Okay, if that's the case, then they'll seat the customer, and then everything else matches our traditional restaurant model. So a little bit of a swerve here. We did have an additional item here where we talk about the checking the time of the reservation. Because if you have reservations for 6 o'clock and you show up at 2 p.m., they probably are not going to seat you. They're probably going to say, look, your reservation, you're a little bit early. You're a little bit early. You're in a different time zone. Okay. You're in a different time zone. So that's going to be one of those clarification points that we want to be careful of. All right. So that was the easy part, the BPMN diagram. Now we're moving on to question 5. We're going to talk about the UML class diagrams for traditional fast food restaurants. And we're going to discuss similarities and differences. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the natural delineation here. So the good news is UML diagrams are more complex than BPMN diagrams, but for the most part, our UML diagram for fast food restaurants and traditional restaurants are going to be the same, because what we're going to identify is they contain the same classes. What are our classes again? We have 3 types of classes. What are they? Generally, we have 4 types of classes, but 3 that we're going to be responsible for developing in our entity model: resources, events, and agents. Okay, so let's start out with the linchpin, because remember we start out with the events and we move outward from there. Okay, so there's 2 primary events that occur whenever you go to a restaurant. Okay, whenever you go to a restaurant, what are those two primary events going to be? The order or the sales transaction, good. And then what's going to happen after that? The cash receipt, where you actually have to pay for your meal. All right. So what are the resources that are going to be exchanged in that particular series of transactions? The meal, the food itself. Okay. And then do you have to actually give up anything for food? Wouldn't it be a wonderful world if you could just walk into a restaurant and say, give me a Mexican pizza, and they just gave it to you? Wouldn't that be great? Unfortunately, even a Taco Bell, which is very cheap food, we do have to give up something. What is that? Cash. For some of you who have got crypto, maybe you can get crypto. Can you buy things at Taco Bell with crypto? I don't know. It's been a while. All right, so we're going to give up our cash and the resources. What about agents? Who's involved in this transaction? The customers and the employees? It's a pretty traditional agent series. All right, so if that's the case, we got a pretty simple UML diagram. Something like that. Now, if you didn't get all these multiplicities right, that's fine. But one thing I would like to note is be very, very conscientious of the associations here. Okay. One thing you're going to note, the employees and customers do have associations with both sales and cash receipts. But menu items and cash, our resources, do not necessarily cross over to our events. Because the menu items are only involved in sales. We don't care what the menu items are when we get to cash receipts. We already know what the cash amount's going to be. And cash is not necessarily involved in the sales transaction, only in cash receipts transaction. So that association assignment is really important. I will say this is really, really critical, because as you start adding more entities, you start adding more classes to your diagram, the more complex they are. We don't want to add associations that don't exist, because they get really, really challenging to chart out. All right. So we got to this point right here. And the 25 says, what happens if you add a reservation? What happens if you add a reservation? So of all the types of classes that we've talked about in this course, what do you think a reservation would most likely be related to? Would it represent a resource? No. Would it represent an event? Maybe. That's a little bit of a dicey proposition. You could talk about an event as an event. I would accept that if you wanted to graph it as an event, and we'll see why. What about an agent? Would it be an agent? No. Could it be called a conceptual structure? That might be something we talk about. So if you want to classify it as event or conceptual structure, either of those are fine. But who's involved in the process of the reservation, or what steps are involved? So first of all, can we say that reservations have a relationship to any of our events here? Probably our sales. There's not going to be a sale if somebody doesn't make their reservation, because if they show up without a reservation, say, sorry, we can't seat you. So we can say there's association with sales. What about, do employees take reservations? Yes. Who actually reserves the reservations? The customers? Yeah, so if we're going to actually note reservations, we're going to note them here. Now I've got them listed as an event here in this particular diagram. I would consider them to be both valid as an event or a conceptual structure, depending on how you view reservations. Because an event, they're kind of an ancillary event if you wanted to look at that. Most important distinction, though, is to understand that we have to, when we add this additional class, we have to identify what are the associations with the existing classes. And I realize that's hard to do because I zoomed way in, so let me make this smaller. And I included the multiplicities in this particular diagram, but are there room for interpretation of multiplicities? Absolutely. One of the most important things to remember when you're interpreting multiplicities are, if a given multiplicity is there, interpret according to the multiplicity it's given. If I do not give you a multiplicity, if you have to create your own diagram, you are free to provide your own license as long as you can explain the multiplicity, okay? So let's say I gave you a blank diagram and say fill in the multiplicities, and you wanted to actually put in 0 to many here. You could say, all right, customers could have 0 reservations, or they could have many reservations. That's how you would interpret that. If you wanted to say 1 to many, say they wouldn't be a customer if they didn't have reservations, that would be a logical interpretation too. Again, the multiplicities are not a one-size-fits-all. They are adaptive, but you do need to be able to effectively explain those. All right. Any questions? Pretty clear on these right here? All right. Again, you are responsible for the UML diagrams at a very high level. These UML diagrams are not going anywhere. I know they're not fun, and I apologize for that, but they're very important to understand because they do depict the structure of the entire system. So as we move forward to the next 2 chapters, please keep up on these. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you all on Monday.